Charles Ardai, welcome back to Suit Up the Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be back. It's terrific to see you.
Your interview that we did the first time remains one of the ones that people compliment me on the most.
Really? See, now I don't understand that. You do such wonderful interviews and you do so
Well,
many.
thank
Why
you.
would they pick that one out? But anyway, maybe it's because of the books in the background. They like
It-
that.
People like the books. I think that
They
that's it.
like
That
them.
and it was definitely the moment the show started to shift
Uh-huh.
towards talking about fiction, writing, and all those fun things. So
Which I know you're passionate about. So it comes through.
that's the
What you love
bookshelves.
comes through bookshelves, exactly. So tell me what you're reading now.
Ooh, currently, I just finished up. We've got an upcoming interview with Gary Phillips, who
Okay,
wrote
sure.
a
Yeah.
charming Mondo pulp collection with, I think, Mystery
Okay.
House Press might have been the publisher. And it was phenomenal. I'm now reading his book, One Shot Harry, which
Oh,
I've
that's
heard
great.
great things about.
Well,
How
I
about
know.
you?
I'm. What am I doing these days? I'm flooded with submissions. I think it's one of those interesting patterns. There are quieter times and then busier times, and just like people join gyms and decide to work out in January, I think people who have been working on a novel finish it up and send it out to publishers in January, which is wonderful. That's not a bad thing at all. But then the flood of material coming in, somehow someone has to deal with it, and Hard Case Crime really is a one-man shop. We work with Titan Books that does an amazing job
Mhm.
actually producing the physical books and getting them into bookstores and doing marketing and many other functions. But the editorial side is just me. And so if we get 1,000 submissions, which we do, I'm the one who has to read those, and I try to do it diligently. And so every January is always a busy time. But other than that, I was reading a book called Lady, That's My Skull.
Ooh.
And a friend showed me the cover. Actually, showed my wife the cover, and then she showed me, and it was purely the title that got them to pay attention to it. And I love old pulp novels with weird titles, and
Mhm.
I never heard of this one. So I tracked down a used copy, and it's sitting on my night table, getting read in small increments. It doesn't look like it's so great
Mhm.
that we're going to hunt down the rights from this relatively obscure author and reprint it. But what a great title that is! We
Mhm.
had Say It with Bullets.
Mhm.
That's a good
Oh,
title. We had The Corpse
beautiful.
Wore Pasties. And Lady, comma, That's My Skull. That's a pretty good title. I can't decide if it's Lady, That's My Skull, like it's not yours, or Lady, That's My Skull, like it's not my tibia. Anyway, we'll find out.
Well, I'll have to look it up now just for sheer
Yeah,
curiosity's
it's
sake.
it's
But
obscure.
uh congratulations, 20
Thank you.
years.
20 years. Who would have thought? Not I. Not I. When Max Phillips and I started Hard Case Crime, which was a little more than 20 years ago, because this is the 20th anniversary of publishing our first title, and it took a few
Mhm.
years of hard work, a lot of elbow grease before we could talk any publisher into working with us and letting us publish our first title. But it's been 20 years. So we published our first two titles, Lawrence Block's Grifter's Game and my partner Max's original novel, Fade to Blonde. Thank you.
Mhm.
Both excellent novels. Max has won the Shamus Award for Best PI paperback that year. And we
Fade to
published.
Blonde, I maintain, is one of my favorites that you guys have
Oh,
ever
that's so great.
published.
Thank you. I will tell Max because he'll get a kick out of that. He hasn't written a novel in many years. This was almost the last one. He did some spy novels under a pseudonym for one of the bigger houses.
Ooh.
But I think he's a tremendous writer, and he continues to do all the graphic design on the line. So all of our covers, which people love,
Mhm.
are designed. The graphic design is by Max. And he's brilliant at it. It's one of his enormous talents. He's also a font designer. He designs
Mm.
typefaces. So some of the type that you see on the covers was not just laid out, but designed. Every letter was designed by Max, and of course the Hard Case Crime logo that appears in the corner of every cover
Mhm.
is a Max Phillips creation. But anyway, yes, so Fate to Blonde, he was the first original novel. My Richard Alias novel, Little Girl Lost, was the second a month later. That was 2004, and somehow it's now 2024. How did that happen? I don't know. We thought, Max and I, when we started, we thought we would put out 6 books because we had a
Mhm.
contract with Dorchester Publishing, the dear departed Dorchester Publishing, for 6 books. And we thought, well, we'll do 6. They'll never
Mhm.
want to talk to us again. And that'll be the end of it. And we'll be happy. We'll look on the shelf. There will be our 6 books. Now it's 20 years later, and we've published more than 100, probably more than
Mhm.
150. It's a little hard to keep track of the number, but
That was my first question, actually, is how many actual titles have you guys
well,
published at this point?
so it depends how you count and what you count. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we started also, in addition to traditional novels, publishing
Mhm.
graphic novels. So
Mhm.
you count those. If you count those, you probably don't count every issue of a comic book separately. So it's a little hard to say, but I think it's north of 150. if you count the graphic novels. It's probably just slightly under 150 if you don't. But it's like 147 versus
Mhm.
160, some number like
Yeah.
that. So let's call it 150, something along those lines, which is far more than I ever thought we would do. But it's great fun, getting to work with some of these writers that I grew up reading and
Hmm.
admired. Lawrence Block is my favorite living mystery writer
Yes.
and has been forever. He's wonderful. And to get to work with him, not just once, but on a half dozen different books. And now in our 20th anniversary. So Lawrence Block is a very difficult guy to reprint. Now, he's not
Hmm.
a difficult guy. He's a great guy. He's a great friend, but difficult to reprint because almost every book he ever wrote, including some of the very obscure early erotica he wrote, he has brought back into print as a self-publisher. He's a self-publishing maven.
Oh.
He has taken, when I first met him, these were out of print. When I first started Hard Case Crime, these were out of print. But in the meantime, he discovered self-publishing. And so he brought dozens of his old books back. Um, as ebooks mostly, and I think print on demand paperbacks.
Hmm.
And so there just isn't anything left that hasn't been brought back. And I said to him, what should we do for the 20th anniversary? I want a book by you in line.
Hmm.
And we both remembered that there was this book that he completed. He didn't start, but he finished for Cornell Woolrich. So
Yes.
Cornell Woolrich was the author of, most famously, Rear Window. He also wrote quite a lot of other novels. The most famous is probably The Bride Wore Black, which became a Truffaut film. So already
Oh,
his
yes.
cinematic history is great. Right.
Hmm.
So La Marie était en Noir was the Truffaut film, The Bride Wore Black. And of course, Hitchcock did Rear Window. So
Hmm.
Woolrich's legacy would be complete, even if those were the only two films ever made. But there were like 100 movies made out of
Wow.
his short stories and books, and radio plays, and I think stage plays too. And they weren't all good, of course,
Hmm.
but he was
That's
the
the key to be
brilliant.
prolific. Just keep making more.
He was prolific and somehow sold to Hollywood. There are prolific authors who never sell anything. He sold everything to Hollywood. Despite that, he was a miserable person. Um, Died lonely after losing his leg to gangrene because he wouldn't leave the hotel room that he lived with his mother in until the end of her life, and then lived in alone after her death. It's really a tragic story. His life
Yeah.
was miserable, but his books are beautiful. Anyway, he was working on a book at the end called Into the Night. He didn't finish it. And in
Hmm.
fact, when the manuscript was found, the typescript in his room was missing the opening pages too. So the closing pages, very often, if there's an unfinished book at an author's death, the closing pages aren't there.
Hmm.
The opening pages usually are. And in this case, the first 15 pages or so were gone. And so his estate brought in Lawrence Block to complete the book, which in this case meant having to write the opening pages and the
Hmm.
closing pages and a bunch in
Oh.
between because there were other manuscript pages that were just gone. And he did a wonderful job. You couldn't tell where the opening pages by Block ended and the continuing pages by Woolrich began. But neither he nor I think any other reader who read the book was ever satisfied with the ending. So
Okay.
what Larry tried to do was be true to the signs in the manuscript of what Woolrich intended the ending to be. And Woolrich
Mm.
apparently intended to give his characters a happy ending. But a happy ending in a Woolrich novel it's like steak in a vegetarian restaurant. It doesn't go. And I respect that Larry tried to stick to what Woolrich would have done,
Hmm.
but we all read it and said that may be what he would have done, but
Hmm.
it's not satisfying for the reader
Hmm.
because this book badly needed a bleak, dark, down ending.
I'm
And
so
so,
excited now.
well, it's going to get one. So this is Into the Night, the new edition. This is an
And
advanced copy.
the
And
cover is gorgeous too, by the way.
thank
I
you.
mean,
It was,
that should go without saying for a hard case crime book, but like that one, I'm
well,
finding
thank you.
that when they have that silhouette quality,
Uh-huh.
sometimes it adds this. Maybe it's the Bond fan in me that's like
Maybe that
seeing
could
the
be.
pre-title sequence stuff, but
Right. The Bond girls writhing in,
mhm.
surrounded by flames or goopy dropping gelatin pebblets or whatever they are. But yeah, so this was painted by a guy named Gregory Manchess, who also painted Fade to Blonde way back when. So he's come
Oh.
full circle. I went to him and I said, you painted the cover for our first original novel. I want you to do one. And at this point, he's basically a gallery painter. He does very few book
Mhm.
covers, but he came back and did it, and it's beautiful. So Into the Night has a new ending because Larry said, you know what, let's give it the ending it should have had to begin with. Let's
Mhm.
let's do that. And so it has a brand new ending that no one's ever seen. So even if you picked up this book 35 years ago when it was published, it's been unavailable since then. You have not read this book. I also went through the whole manuscript as if Woolrich were still alive and I could
Mhm.
nag him. And I went line by line and I did the kind of edit it needed. Um,
Mhm.
Larry's pages didn't need any editing. They were perfect. But Woolrich's pieces, sometimes the writing was gorgeous. The individual sentences were gorgeous, but sometimes there were things that were inconsistent. Like on page 5, there's a photograph. The main character sees a photograph of a man, but by page 103, she says she has no idea what he looks like. Well, in that case, she can't see the photograph on page whatever, because then she would know what he looks like. And it was really important to the plot. So I had the photograph torn in half. So she only sees him from the lips down. And that's why she can't recognize. Anyway, so that kind of editing fix I put in so that people who read the book will no longer be bothered by the kind of inconsistencies, to be fair, that Woolrich was sort of famous for. He was not the most meticulous when it came to plotting. But what works about a Woolrich novel is the heartbreaking suspense and the tension and the misery. And though he did that beautifully. So I think people will find that the ending is suitably heartbreaking for a Woolrich novel. Anyway, I'm excited for people to read it and discover it.
That is so cool. When again I looked at the slate, I was like, okay, first of all, this is a banger slate of amazing books. But I mean, we're definitely going to talk about Death Comes Too Late, but and of course all of them. But that title, Into the Night, I was really, really interested in, just because it has the Rear Window connection, which I haven't read the short story that the film was based on yet, but I want to now. I've recently heard a great podcast discussion on like how the screenplay, the adaptation process. And now it has me like, oh, I need to dig into this, because I didn't know that he was a prolific author who wrote a whole bunch of other things.
Right. Oh, you should definitely read it. His style was very cinematic. So very often on a Woolrich page, you will see the shape of the light. He talks about the triangles and the wedges, and it's all described as if he were a cinematographer, which he wasn't, but he spent time in Hollywood. And very often the visuals are described so intensely and so precisely that you can really see it unfold in front of your inner eye, your mind's eye. And not many writers do that. I don't do that. So for instance, I like to think I'm a good writer, but I write differently. I don't know what my characters look like. If you ask me what my main character in any book, I don't know what they look like. And I don't describe, I mean, maybe I say a character's a redhead or something like that, very tall. But with Woolrich, you really know, if you're on an elevated train, you know how many seats are on that train. You see the background going outside the windows. It's really wonderful.
There was a comment once someone said about Fleming, which was that if you walk into a bar and there's a man sitting on the stool, he would describe everything except the man, unless he was like malformed or something like that. Because then, of course,
you know what watch he wears.
Yes.
You know what he's drinking. You probably know what he's smoking, but you don't necessarily know what he looks like. That's true. That's true. And some wonderful writers are like that. So I don't think that's a bad thing. But one of the things that Woolrich did really well was describe things visually. And it's only one of several. He has a lot of really good traits. People make fun of some of his excesses. Some of his prose is purple in the same way that Lovecraft.
Isn't that the reason we turn to pulp fiction, is for the purple prose?
It's funny. So sometimes there are two, right? So there are two models of pulp fiction. There's the purple prose, like Edgar Allan Poe, Woolrich, and Lovecraft. And then there's the exceptionally terse Hemingway style, James M. Cain, Paul Kane style prose, where every sentence is, it was hot. You walk down the stairs. And, both models work, right? You've got Hammett, who's very sharp and very cut. And then you've got Woolrich, who is all over the map. And both styles can be great fun to read.
Well, let's talk about one of the other books you guys have coming out, which is Death Comes Too Late. This cover.
Death Comes Too Late. So this is Paul Mann's work.
Yes, who's perfect because it has big Bond vibes to it.
Yeah, so Paul has painted a lot of his own versions of movie posters for a variety of movies, the Indiana Jones movies, the James Bond movies, and he's a brilliant painter. He's inspired by a previous generation of painters like Robert McGinnis, and you can see McGinnis's lines in his in Paul's paintings. And of course, McGinnis painted the original Sean Connery James Bond movie posters and many covers for us. So this cover, I had never had a Paul Mann cover for one of my books, and I asked Paul if he would do this one. And because it's a short story collection, a montage approach made sense rather than picking one scene from one story. So each element is from a different story. There's a story set during Carnival in Brazil, so the mask is from that. And there are two stories set in Times Square, so the guy running through Times Square is from that. But in any event, the idea here, so Death Comes Too Late, the concept was I wanted to do a book of my own to commemorate the anniversary. I did one when we had published our 50th title, which was only about 5 years in. was called 50 to 1. And in that book, I wrote a novel that was told in 50 chapters, set 50 years ago. And each chapter used the title of one of our books in order. So the first book was Grifter's Game. Chapter 1 was called Grifter's Game. Second book was Fate to Blonde. Chapter 2 was called Fate to Blonde. I had to make up a story that linked all 50 titles. Well, if I wanted to do that again now with 150 titles, the book would be, you couldn't bind it. It would be too long, and people would get
multi-volume set.
At least it'd be like, Harry Potter and so I didn't do that. I didn't want to write a 200,000 word book. That's silly. But I thought, what could I do that would be shorter? And the idea was, how about we'll do a collection of 20 short stories to celebrate 20 years. So 20 stories by the founder of Hard Case Crime. And I went back more than 20 years into my own prolific past and pulled stories that were as old as maybe 30 or 33 years old. But I picked out my 20 favorite stories that I published, including one that won the Edgar Award called The Homefront. One was a finalist for the Seamus Award called Nobody Wins. By the way, I picked that title intentionally for it to get an award nomination because I really liked the idea that the person with the envelope would open it and say, and the winner is Nobody Wins. And I thought that would be funny. But I didn't seriously think it would get nominated. And then it did. And then it didn't win, which proves something or other. I don't know what. So I intended to write a follow-up story with the same characters called Hold On a Second, I Can't Get This Envelope Open. But I never wrote it. But if I had, I bet it would have gotten nominated for something. Oh, well, that's my sense of humor. It was my sense of humor even before I had a kid. Now it's a dad's sense of humor.
Now it's found just new utility.
Now it's found, exactly. It makes my daughter angry, which is good. That's what it's for. So Death Comes Too Late. I've been posting an excerpt from each story over the last 12 or 13 days, and I'll post another one each day until I've run out of stories. And in doing that, this is on Twitter or whatever we call it now. And
which I just want to comment, if people don't follow you on Twitter, they're missing out because your editorial comments on submissions there are only two reasons I still have Twitter, or X as it is now. The first was for Nassim Taleb, who's like this Lebanese economist who's fascinating, love his stuff. He has great tweets, but then your Twitter feed is the only other reason I keep Twitter.
I appreciate that, although I will admit that I stopped doing the snarky comments on submissions because it was hurting some people's feelings, and I didn't want to do that. If we got a submission that was really peculiar, quirky, weird, of a squirrel that solves mysteries on the planet Jupiter, I thought that was a funny thing to mention. And I think people thought that was fine. But, if we got a really bad submission and it was just bad in some spectacular way, I would sometimes point that out. And I thought it was funny. I mean, we'd never use the name, of course. We would never say who it was. It was just some random submission. But, some people didn't like it. And I looked back at it and I said, you know what? Yeah, I don't have to be a jerk. It's not nice. I'm a nice guy. And so I'm not doing that anymore, but I'm posting all sorts of other things. So I won't make fun of somebody's bad submission. The truth is I've made bad submissions. We all have, especially early in your career. It's okay. Cornell Woolrich wrote bad sentences. Everyone has bad sentences. So, but I am still on Twitter and I am still posting hopefully some fun things. And, the thing I realized in going through the stories in the book one by one is just what a strange, varied set of inspirations produced. Granted, it is over 3 decades, but there are stories that are specifically homages to Woolrich and Raymond Chandler and Robert Van Gulik, who wrote these mysteries set in 5th century China. And these were all people who inspired me along the way. And then there's a story that's sort of Roger Rabbit-y, only instead of cartoon characters, it's comic book characters, but it's a world where comic book characters are actual people, living people who pose for artists who draw them into comic books, but they have superpowers. It's a weird story. Most of the book isn't like that. Most of the book is just, straight crime fiction, but that one, it's kind of fun. I don't know. I like it. So in any event, if somebody wants to read a novella set in 11th century China, there's one of those. There are 19 others that are not that, but there is one of those. So hopefully people will pick it up. I know short stories are people who are passionate about them really love them. And then there are people who say, I don't want to read short stories. I only like novels. That's fine. Then they don't have to get this book, but I hope they do.
Well, that's the thing. So I really wasn't into short stories until like 2 years ago or something like that. I started just finding that it was nice to have, open a book, read a short story a night type thing.
Right. Exactly. It's just a quick fix.
Well, on top of it, what's fascinating then is like with what you've done here, the fact is not every story is going to land with someone, but the reality is the highs will be really high. And that's the cool part is that there's always something different. Even when it's not like your flavor, you can still usually find something good out of it to go, wow. I mean, like
I
that
totally,
genre.
totally agree. And I've had that experience with other authors' short story collections. Lawrence Block, for instance, writes brilliant short stories. They're
Mhm.
absolutely wonderful. If you read a collection of 20 of his short stories, they won't all be your favorite. That goes without saying. But he's an example of someone whose short stories are consistently amazing. So if I could recommend that somebody develop a habit for short stories, Lawrence Block, that's where you'll go right.
Mhm.
There's an old time writer who's mostly forgotten now named Stanley Ellen. Stanley Ellen wrote a number of stories that became very famous and ended up adapted on the Hitchcock TV show and other TV
Oh,
shows. He was a meticulous writer who would write exactly one short story a year, and he sold it to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. That's it, one short story a year. And he would labor over every sentence. He wouldn't move on to the next sentence until he was satisfied with the first sentence and so on. And that's why he could only write one short story a year. He also wrote novels, which he couldn't do at that pace, obviously. But his short stories, and they're so wonderful. They're polished and wonderful. There's one called The Specialty of the House, which is about a mysterious restaurant that serves a mysterious dish. And I won't spoil, even though it's a very old
hmm.
story, I won't spoil it. But if you can find a collection of Stanley Ellen stories, really outstanding. And there are other short story writers like that. Jack Ritchie. Nobody remembers Jack Ritchie, but his stories were wonderful. So I highly recommend that fans of crime fiction go out and pick up some short stories. I won't object if they start with mine. That would be fine. And the book's coming out in March. But I think whether it's mine or somebody else's, do yourself a favor. Reading a really good crime story, a short story, it's not like a deficient version of a novel. It
Hmm.
actually, a really good crime story has short story has attributes that make it in some ways better than a novel. It's got this concision. Think of your favorite short story you ever read. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, right?
Hmm.
Maybe it's The Veldt by Ray Bradbury. And you think of that and you say, I don't wish that story were twice the length.
Hmm.
That's the right length. That it you go in, you get to the end, it punches you in the face like a pile driver, and you put down the book and you say, wow. You don't say, man, I wish that had been 300 pages. So I think people should redevelop the love of short stories that many of us had when we were kids, but somewhere along the way gave
Hmm.
up on.
Recently, we had a conversation with Jim Beard about how, like Fleming short stories, that
Okay.
some arguably Fleming's short stories are better than his novels in some cases.
I was just talking with a professor who teaches a course on James Bond, among other things,
Oh, so
and
cool.
she expressed exactly that opinion, that the short stories are in some cases better than the novels. And she also told me that there's an audiobook edition, I think, with Tom Hiddleston reading the short stories. And she
Ooh.
said that's wonderful. And so I have not tracked it down, but I believe she said that, and I believe it was the truth. So maybe out there's a really cool Hiddleston reads Fleming.
I think that's Octopussy and the Living Daylights.
That's probably right. That's
Because I'm
probably
doing the mental, which ones do I already have and which ones don't I have? And I
right.
think that that's the one.
Well, I have a good friend who now works for the Ian Fleming estate, the company that handles all the Ian Fleming material.
Oh,
We haven't
cool.
done anything at Hard Case Crime, and it's not obvious that we could or what it would be.
I
But
still think it'd be awesome if you guys did a Spy Who Loved Me edition. That,
I told him that. I said Spy Who Loved Me. For those of you in the audience who don't know, The Spy Who Loved Me is the odd one out of the James Bond novels. The film has nothing to do with the book. The book
mhm.
is told in the first person by a woman who falls in love with or gets fallen in love with by James Bond. And it's a hard-boiled crime story. It's set in
Mhm.
a remote motel somewhere in the United States. It's not gadgets. It's not foreign locales. It's a pair of very tough guys who are menacing this woman, and a knock comes on the door some rainy night, and there's a man at the door, and it happens to be James Bond. It's a terrific book. And I would love to do an edition. I don't know that the company, whichever one it is that
Yeah.
publishes the book, would like us to do our own edition, but I would be delighted. So
Mhm.
who knows? We'll see.
It reminds me a lot of the Killers. I've also gone through and started
Yeah,
reading Hemingway short stories, and again, it has
yeah,
that kind of
Killers are
those
great.
vibes to it. So, actually, one of the questions I had
Yeah.
was Stephen King has referred to you as the master of the short story, which
To be fair,
is
he has referred to me as a master of the
a
short story.
master
I
of
think
the
that
short
still
story.
leaves room for Edgar Allan Poe and some of these other
True.
people. And it was very kind of Stephen King to say that. He's a very generous guy. As you know, Hard Case Crime exists largely because of Stephen King. We didn't know him when we started, but we reached out to him hoping that maybe he would be willing to help us get off the ground by providing a blurb, just say something nice
Mhm.
about our line of books if he liked them. That might induce people to pick them up and give them a try. And he decided that instead of doing that, he wanted to write a book for us. And that ended up being 2 books, and that ended up being 3 books. And we've now worked together for 20 years,
That's
almost
so
20 years.
cool.
And it really is. And he's a great, great person. I really like him, and the books are wonderful. And of course, they're by far best-selling books. And so when I was receiving an award, which was wonderful also, they managed to get Stephen King to present it, which I didn't know was going to happen. I was at an MWA, which is Mystery Writers of America banquet, and I received an award for my contributions to the genre of the mystery publishing. And Stephen King presented the award, and it was in that context that he said, and he's done these things. He started Hard Case Crime, and he's a master of the short story. And when I was putting the short story collection together, I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, listen, I know you said that, but you said it in a private room. Granted, it was videotaped. It's on YouTube. Anyone can see it. But do you mind if I quote that? Because, the things you say
Yeah.
when giving an award, that maybe that was more generous than you meant it to be." And he said, "No, absolutely. Please put that on the book cover." And I was very grateful that he let me do that. I have the same amount of imposter syndrome that anyone has,
Mhm.
maybe more, who knows? So I sit down to write, and it's a struggle. And I always wonder, is that sentence good or not good? But I'm not Stanley Ellen, so I don't work on it forever. I keep moving. And so I look at my work and I say, there's some stories here that are terrible. And those didn't go in the book. And there are some stories that are fine, but they're not amazing. And those didn't go in the book either. Hopefully, the ones that went in the book, people will really enjoy. But then I look at the people I idolize and admire, some of whom I've named already, and I think, I'm not a master like they're a master, right? I mean, these are the people who are great. Hemingway is a master. Salinger is a master. Bernard Malamud was a master. Philip Roth was pretty darn good. Am I in that league? Well, I'm not going to say I am. However, I do think if people pick up the book, they're going to have a good reading experience. It's going to make them happy. Well, I won't say that. They are mostly depressing stories, but hopefully it will satisfy them in the way that Woolrich's depressing stories
That's
satisfy.
the thing about your Little Girl Lost duology is
Uh,
really like when I read those books, because I didn't know that you had written them originally. I
yeah, it's under a
remember
pseudonym.
they are when I read it, I was like, this is what noir is in its
Thank you.
pure sense. And to
They're
this
very
day,
dark.
I look at that as part of the gold standard for if you can feel that way towards the end of the book, then that is what the noir genre is like at its best doing.
I really appreciate that. That's what I was trying to do. I've also written books that are comedies, and I enjoy doing it, and I like making people laugh. But dark fiction has so much more weight for me and so much more satisfaction. It just is what gives me pleasure when I read it, and it's a weird kind of pleasure, but it is
Mhm.
genuinely pleasure. One of the stories in Death Comes Too Late is all leading up to the final line.
Mhm.
And in fact, I don't think the opening lines of the story are all that great. I'm going to quote them because I've been doing the opening lines on Twitter every day. Eventually, I'll get to the story and I'll quote them, and they'll be okay. No, nobody's going to think they're terrible, but they're not brilliant. But the last line, I was so happy when I came up with the last line to that story, and so while it's not my very best story, it was nominated for an award, but it
Mhm.
didn't win the award. Um, but the last line is so chilling and
Mhm.
satisfying that I'm hoping that people have the same feeling they had at the end of Little Girl Lost reading that story when they get to the last line. Hopefully, you it's like turning the last page of a book and getting
Mhm.
a surprise you didn't expect. With a short story, there aren't that many pages, but the last sentence can really deliver a punch. So anyway, that's something I've tried to do, and I think there are a lot of writers who have done a really good job of creating a setting, developing characters that you really love, telling a story that you don't want to leave. And then
Mhm.
one of the hardest things to do, and I find a lot of really good writers find it too painful to do it, is make those characters suffer,
Mhm.
make something really bad happen. And you don't have to, a book can be Jane Austen. Bad things happen and then they get resolved. Um, Even, you know, Dickens has
Mhm.
bad things happening to their, like I'm thinking of um Oliver Twist, with Bill Sykes and Nancy, right? And that horrible fate in the end. Uh is incredibly powerful for a reader. It's cathartic. It's
Mhm.
terrifying. It's all those things. So I've read many books sometimes that where I've really liked the book, and I've thought, is this right? Is this writer going to see it through to the end?
Mhm.
Is this writer going to stick to the goal of demonstrating just how awful life can be? That doesn't have to be everyone's goal, but are they going to do it? And very often I find a book dissatisfying if they don't. If at the last minute they let things end well. That's not to say that's a bad thing to do. It's just not what I find satisfying. So in my books, in my stories, very often things end unhappily. Consider that a trigger warning for anyone who, who might otherwise not enjoy reading these stories. Out of 20 stories, how many end with someone committing suicide? How many end with someone committing suicide? More than zero. Let's just say that.
Well, and this is a conversation I've had with some people. The reality is heroes don't tend to have happy endings. And I think that
Interesting point. You
that's
mean in
that
real
element
life
of
or in
tragedy.
fiction?
Both to a certain degree. I think that most of our Greek myths, that one can argue most of our stories are continual expositions upon, they tend to end tragically.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Unless you're reading Aristophanes, in which case it's all, funnily enough, or interestingly enough, I remember reading Aristophanes thinking, how funny will this old comedy be after centuries? And it reminded me very strongly of Three's Company. And I thought, well, some things never change, right? Some of the gags, some of the things people found funny back in centuries ago are still making sitcom viewers laugh today. Granted, Three's Company now is 50 years old, but I'm sure it's like some sitcom on TV today too.
The wheel always turns. We still
Always.
like the same things. A quick shout
With
out
you. Yes.
to Soho Sins was a book that
Okay.
you guys
Thank
have
you.
published that I remember that ending. Definitely not gonna spoil it, but it was one of those things where I'm like, oh, so this is how it ends. And then we get like the next of the epilogue one, epilogue two,
Right.
and I just felt my heart drop
Yeah.
and drop. And to this day, it haunts me.
I'm so glad to hear that. So Soho Sins, which was written by a guy named Richard Vine, it was his first novel. He's very big in the art world. He edited one of the major art magazines, like studio art, gallery art. And I think it's a brilliant book. I loved it. It's hard for me to know why some books break out and some books don't. That one, it got some very good reviews, but I don't think it ever found a very large readership. Unlike,
Mm,
for example, another book we published more recently that was hugely successful as a first novel. It was the first novel that this author wrote under a new pen name, so it's
mhm.
quasi first novel, which was Five Decembers by James Kestrel. Now that book, I think, is widely considered maybe the best book we've ever published. It won the Edgar Award for Best Novel. It deserved it. It's a
It's
beautiful book,
beautiful.
really amazing. I think Soho Sins is comparable,
Mhm.
but one book reached many thousands more or tens of thousands more readers than the other, and I can't explain why. But I think you're right, and if people have a chance to read Soho Sins, I would highly recommend it. But yes, they're both quite dark. Although I guess, not to spoil anything, but I guess Five Decembers, although very dark, doesn't have the very darkest or bleakest of endings. There is
No,
some redemption, there is some hope in that ending, whereas Soho Sins is pretty darn pretty bad. Um, Wonderful, but
mhm.
pretty bad for the characters.
Yeah, it's again, like I said, it's just it gut punch
It is
there.
a
But
cut.
Five Decembers, I think what it does really well is not to use the airplane illusion because, World War II elements, but I think that it really does stick the landing perfectly. And that might be the reason why it works so well for so many people, is it manages to somehow balance incredibly dark elements with the idea that there is some hope and the
Yeah, I
redemption for
think
the
that's true.
characters.
I think that's a big part of what appeals to people. It's a sweeping story, epic. It covers the entirety of World War II.
It
It
feels
really,
like something that would be adapted by Spielberg, like genuinely. And
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
just
yeah.
referring because of the war elements. It just
Yeah, well,
has
right.
that
So there are
kind of
war elements.
feel.
Well, it's been optioned for the movies, not by
Ooh,
Spielberg, but by someone else who's as well known as Spielberg. And we'll see if anything gets made. I've been waiting for the announcement, so I don't want to be the one who spoils it by
yeah.
spilling the beans here. But a very significant production company has optioned it, and I believe what ended up happening, of course, is that the writers' strike and the actors' strike intervened, and they couldn't do much work developing the screenplay for months and
Ugh.
months. But I'm really hoping to see it come out. It would make a tremendous movie. There's no question, and I think a lot of people would really uh, enjoy it and maybe discover the book after seeing the movie. So I'm crossing my fingers.
So segueing talking movies to books, because I also want to talk about Fast Charlie.
Okay, Fast
This
Charlie.
book, first of all, because I'm a Bond fan and well known to be a hard case crime fan, I had multiple people the moment this was announced, like, have you heard they're doing one that has like a movie with Pierce Brosnan in it? And I'm like, oh, okay. I actually had ordered it twice by accident
Oh
because
my
I
God.
had pre-ordered it like well in advance and then went, oh crap, I need to make sure I ordered the book. And then I have two on my doorstep when the
Yeah, I
publication
got
day
two
arrives.
copies of not that book, but I ordered two by accident or something else. I don't mind. I gave one to a friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
I always look at it as this is the opportunity to give the joy of fiction to
exactly.
other
It's
people.
not that expensive. These books are cheap, but not as cheap as they used to be. Back in the day, you could get a paperback for 25 cents. I wish we could sell our books for 25 cents. That would be great. But relatively speaking, it's
Yeah.
about the price. I think when books were 25 cents, a movie ticket was 25 cents, and
I
now a
say,
movie
yeah.
ticket is $10 plus, and so is a book. But Fast Charlie. So Fast Charlie just came out as a movie.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't want to sound like a backhanded compliment, but I want to say it's a surprisingly good movie. Why do
Hmm.
I say surprisingly good? It's a good movie. Why not just say that? Well, I say surprisingly because it kind of came and went without getting much attention. It
Because
was in
it got very
theaters,
limited
very
theatrical
limited.
release, from what I
Yeah, I think
understand. It was
in
almost
movie
directly
theaters.
on digital.
Right. It went almost directly to streaming. And the result, you hear, oh, this movie went direct to streaming. How good can it be? It's actually quite good. So it
Hmm.
was directed by Philip Noyce, who did Clear and Present Danger and Salt and a bunch of other major movies. It stars Pierce Brosnan, who is as good as he ever was, a little grayer, but so am I. And James Caan from The Godfather in his last performance. He's quite old and a little bit frail, but he's playing a character who's supposed to be quite old and a little bit frail.
Perfect
And,
casting there.
perfect casting. It's a mob boss, and seeing James Caan one last time as a mob boss is really it's quite beautiful. And Morena Baccarin from Firefly is the second lead, and all the performances are really quite good. It's shot down in I think New Orleans, somewhere Louisiana, and the book itself was set in Florida, but I guess they probably got better tax breaks in Louisiana or whatever it was. But it works fine. And yeah, it's the story. Brosnan is a fixer. He's not a hitman, but he's someone who pulls the trigger a lot on behalf of his aging mob boss. And one of the mob boss's rivals wants to take over the territory, comes in with guns blazing. Everyone on the crew gets killed except Brosnan. Now he's single-handedly up against all this bad guy's men, which is an even fight because it's Pierce Brosnan.
Yeah.
And it's great. It's very violent. It's occasionally gory. It's quite funny. The plot works. It's just in the old days, you
Hmm.
used to have crime pictures the way you now have horror pictures. So you have
Hmm.
slasher pictures and other kinds of horror movies, which are relatively low budget, filmed relatively quickly. You've got a lot of them, so you take your pick. You don't have to watch them all, and they give you some satisfaction. They're like potato chip movies, right? You can't
Hmm.
just one. So you watch a bunch of these horror movies and you have fun with them. Crime movies used to be like that. You used to get these low budget crime movies and you could just enjoy them. They didn't have to be the biggest thing on it. They didn't have to be Mission Impossible. Mission Impossible is great, but you don't have to have every movie be a $300 million stunt spectacular. And
Yeah.
what I like
You
about
make
Fast
more
Charlie,
money not doing that these
I
days.
would think you do. I mean, unless you happen to make Barbie, in which case it's $1 billion, but that's a real lottery ticket. And
I mean, when
yeah,
you cast Ryan Gosling, what else do you
well, that
expect?
would be good. So Ryan Gosling has two connections, by the way, two connections to Hard Case Crime. I will share both of
Ooh.
them with you.
Oh,
One,
that's yes. Hmm.
so there was a movie called The Nice Guys, written and directed by Shane Black. Really good. I had the privilege of writing the novelization, which was a lot of fun. And Ryan Gosling, unless I'm mixing him up with Bradley Cooper or someone, I'm pretty sure it was Ryan Gosling and Russell Crowe who were the leads
Yes.
in that movie.
Hmm.
So
Both
Ryan,
spectacular.
and they're right, they played off each other really well. They're not known as comedians, especially, but they played off very well. So The Nice Guys was Ryan Gosling. And then more recently, there's a movie that hasn't come out yet called The Actor. So The Actor is based on a book we published by Donald Westlake called Memory. And it's about an actor who goes on tour in the 1950s. He's having an affair with a married woman. The husband walks in. On page one, he picks up a chair and smashes it into the guy's head, and the man develops brain damage. And at that
Hmm.
point, he's no longer able to form memories. He doesn't remember who he is. His only clue as to who he is what's in his wallet. And he's
Hmm.
stranded far from home, and he doesn't even know who he is. And how does he get home? There's no act of violence in the entire book. For the rest of the book, after page one, that assault is the single act of violence in the book, but it's filled with dread and
Mhm.
horror and the terror of losing your identity. And it's a beautiful, brilliant book. And it was optioned by Ryan Gosling, who was going to play the lead. But then I think he ended up conflicted because he was filming The Fall Guy, which is
Oh,
the major series. So that's coming
yes.
out.
Oh, I'm so excited. It's directed by the guys that did John Wick, and I'm like,
Yes,
yes.
I think that's right. I saw a trailer and it looked very Wick-like in terms of the action. So I hope that movie's good, but it meant that Gosling couldn't play the lead, and the lead is now being played by Andre Holland, who
Ooh,
was in Moonlight, a very good
okay.
actor. And
Yes.
the female lead is Gemma Chan, who was in
Hmm.
Crazy Rich Asians, I think. In any
Hmm.
event, it's got a very good cast. It's an indie movie, not very high budget, but you don't need high budget for this kind of noir movie.
Hmm.
And there's still a Ryan Gosling connection because I think he's executive producer or something like
Yeah.
that. I like to think of Ryan Gosling as our little connection into Hollywood because he seems to like this stuff. But will we ever do anything with him again? I don't know. But the actor will come out, so we're going to re-release Memory
Okay.
as a trade paperback with the new title when the movie comes
Hmm.
out. But at this point, I don't know when the movie's coming out, so and I don't have a picture of Andre Holland to use on the cover yet, so I can't tell you when it's coming. But hopefully this year. I'd like that to
Okay.
be a 20th anniversary title. Um,
That's really neat.
yeah, so it's fun to have. I know we've gotten a little bit of field, but it's fun to have books that are connected to movies
Hmm.
once in a while. Most of our books, the vast majority, have painted covers.
Hmm.
Uh, if we do a movie tie-in, we'll very often use a photograph of the star of the movie on the
Hmm.
cover.
I
That's what we
mean,
did.
to be fair, as much as like, yes, I like hot chick paintings, don't get me wrong, but like,
Who
it is
doesn't?
Pierce Brosnan
It's Pierce Brosnan,
who
right? He is the male equivalent of a hot chick, if
he
ever there was
is.
one. He's gorgeous. I'm not ashamed to say it. I will say we actually went back and forth with the movie studio for months and months trying to get a photograph of Pierce Brosnan. Just bureaucracy, just the usual stuff of
Hmm.
has he approved this? How does Pierce Brosnan approve something? And then finally we got the photograph, and Max, my partner, who co-creator of the line, went to work on it to turn it into a cover, and you've seen how it looks. And a day later, after we put the cover up, I got an email from the director of the movie saying, "How did you make that photograph look so good? You did something to it. Can you send me that version of the photograph because I want to use it when we're doing the premiere?" I thought that's great.
Oh,
That made me
that is
so
so
happy.
cool.
I
Well,
have no idea what Max did.
that makes a lot of sense because I was like, this is the exact same image that has been used on like every promo thing that I've
Yeah.
seen. And I just assumed that they sent it over to you guys, but hey, you guys helped create the.
Well, in a very small way. I think we tweaked the colors. We didn't take the picture of Pierce Brosnan.
Mhm.
I think they were probably planning to use that photo anyway because that's why they sent it to us, right? They
Yeah.
gave us the photo that would be in their materials. But I was very proud that the director was happy with whatever small color changes we made. He
Mhm.
was happy with them. That made me happy.
Mhm.
So there could be other film projects. We'll see. I don't have one immediately coming up, but we're always talking to Hollywood and seeing if there's an opportunity to do something. And we'll see.
I'm always excited to see what you guys have, regardless what is. If it's a hard case crime book, I definitely will give it a read. One of the
Yeah,
upcoming ones you guys have is Nobody's Angel, which, speaking of Hollywood connections,
nobody's
Quentin
angel.
Tarantino has said this was his favorite novel of the year, which that's one of those like I know that he's not going to direct many more movies,
Yeah,
which is the sad part because if
sadly.
he was planning on like a long film career, I'd be like, when is Tarantino going to do a hard
A
case
hard
crime
case crime. That
adaptation?
would be great. Well, I'll tell you. So here's the Tarantino story. So I had no idea he was going to say that. I didn't ask him to say that. I didn't contact him and say you should read this book. There was someone on Facebook who was sneering in the way you can only sneer on Facebook. I was just guessing he was sneering. It seemed like it. He said, "Oh, well, you know how these Hollywood things work. I'm sure he never even read the book. They go to him and they say, 'Could you give me a blurb?' And he just makes something up." Actually, in this case, we had no idea he'd even read the book. I was doing nothing, on an average day, and I got a note from Jack Clark, the author of the book, who it's a book about a cab driver in Chicago at a time when Chicago is descending into violence in the
Mhm.
1990s. And at one time, there are two serial killers working the streets of Chicago. One is killing prostitutes, and the other is killing cab drivers. And this
Mm.
cab driver is going to meet them both. And that's the premise of the book. And I got to know, and we published it. So he self-published the book, and this wasn't self-publishing the way we talk about it now.
There
This
was
was
no
before
Amazon to just like
there
crank
was
it
no
out over.
Amazon. He printed 500 copies and he hand sold it to passengers in his taxi. he would say when the password
That
was
is the
getting out, you
hustle.
want, that's a hustle, right? So like $5, give me $5 extra, I'll give you a book. Somehow the book got to me. I read it. It's brilliant. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. And we published our own edition in 2010. So it was quite a long time ago in the small paperback pocket size
Which, to
format.
the credit of that book, that is one of the ones that's hardest for me to try tracking down to like fill in my collection. So
One of
if
the
it's one of
last
the ones no
ones.
one gives up, that
Yeah.
says something.
Well, it's that. And also, we didn't print as many copies because we were working with a company called
Oh.
Dorchester Publishing that
Mhm.
went out of business days after we published that book. And so that's one of the reasons it's so hard to find. Then we went on hiatus for about a year and we came back working with a company called Titan. And Titan is best known for much bigger books like art books and things like that. And we publish our books with them in either the larger trade paperback format or hardcover.
Mhm.
So we don't really do the smaller size anymore, but Nobody's Angel was in the smaller size. And Jack said, I noticed that my sales of my self-published edition were spiking and I couldn't figure out why. Apparently, Quentin Tarantino gave an interview on Amazon and they said, what have you read this year that you liked? And he volunteered out of the blue, completely out of the blue. Hey, my favorite book I read this year, my favorite novel this year was this book by a cab driver called Nobody's Angel. And kudos to Hard Case Crime for publishing it. This is great. This is great. Why, when does this ever happen? You wake up in the morning one day and Quentin Tarantino said something nice about something you did. I don't know him. I don't. So anyway, we said, okay, if Quentin Tarantino feels that way, and he said that, we've got to bring the book back. And so we're bringing it back in a beautiful new trade paperback edition with a brand new cover painting by Claudia Caranfa, who's an Italian painter. And
She is like, I love all your guys' artists, but I have to say she has been on fire with the last covers that she's been doing for you
she
guys.
did 5 Decembers, which was great. She did this one. She really is extremely talented. She also does nude cover paintings for my comic book series, Gun Honey
Yes.
and Heat Seeker, where comic books are sold in stores openly where you can't put nudity on the cover. But what we've done is we've created some special variant editions that are sold in opaque plastic bags, sort of like in the old days you had brown paper wrappers, and they say nude on them, so nobody gets offended. And when they get home and open it up and see what's in there, and Claudia does those paintings absolutely beautifully. They're gorgeous, really gorgeous. They remind me of some of the wonderful nude paintings that were used in connection with the old James Bond movies when Robert Guinness would do, Sean Connery with a harpoon gun and a beautiful naked woman standing next to him. I mean, it's beautiful. So anyway, Claudia did the cover for this, and it's sexy, but not nude, and it's coming out in February, and everyone really should read it. It is a bleak book, it is a dark book, but it is shot through with a certain element of hope. So it has some of the same good qualities that 5 Decembers has, even though it's not set in World War II. It's a completely different book. But yeah, Tarantino. The other thing that happened with Tarantino was when Tarantino was about to make The Hateful Eight, which is not a crime picture. It's a Western, although there is violence in it. And you may remember that the script leaked. And he got
Yes.
very angry. And he said, I'm not going to make the movie. I'm not going to make it. The script leaked. I'm not going to film this movie. Then eventually he changed his mind. But for a while he wasn't. He said to a friend of his, who's a friend of mine also, I'm going to write this as a book. I'm going to write this as a novel. And my friend got in touch with me and said, would you be interested in publishing a novel instead of, if he doesn't do a movie, if he does a novel instead, would you be interested in publishing The Hateful Eight? And I said, well, yes. The first answer is yes. I didn't know what it was. I only knew the title, and then it was a Western, and that would be a bit odd for us, but that's okay. And then eventually, I think he wrote maybe 100 pages of it in a book form, and then put it aside and went and made the movie. But since then, he's been bitten by the writing bug because he wrote a
novelization.
He wrote a novel version of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And although for the mass market paperback edition, they used photographs the same way we did on Fast Charlie, for the hardcover edition, he hired Paul Mann.
Yes.
So Quentin and I were like that. Quentin and I both picked the same painter to paint the cover for our books, and that's kind of cool. I like to think that maybe he discovered Paul Mann because Paul Mann had done hard case crime covers. Of course, that's probably not true because Paul does a lot of work with Hollywood and makes movie posters and so on. So probably Tarantino knew him for that. But I like to think that maybe we introduced him.
Well, Tarantino has said in interviews, at least, again, whether or not it actually follows through, we'll find out. But that after he's done making movies, he wants to start writing and
Yes,
make that
yes,
his
I've heard that.
regular thing.
Oh, I'd
I
love it if he wrote
would
one for us. That would be
be,
great.
it would be like the perfect marriage of like subject and medium is to have a Tarantino
It would be
titled
amazing.
hard
And
case
he
crime
knows our
novel.
books, clearly. He's read at least
Yeah.
one of them. The mutual friend I was mentioning, who's an actor that was in a couple of his movies, but in a very small way. I mean, it's not Brad Pitt. Um, eh, at one point, wanted to give him a birthday present. So I sent my friend a box containing every hard case crime book published to that point, which I think was maybe it was 50, maybe it was 66, maybe in fact maybe that's how he got his hands on Nobody's Angel, and he gave it to Tarantino as a birthday present. But I never heard anything after that, so I have no idea. I had no idea whether it ended up in Tarantino's assistant's hands and he never saw them or what. But actually, given that he read Nobody's Angel, maybe that box of books somehow got into his garage or somewhere, and maybe he's reading through them one by one, and maybe he'll read, he'll read Little Girl Lost and decide that needs to be a TV show or who knows what. But
So cool.
we can dream. Even us
Mhm.
noir writers who are bleak and pessimistic can still have fantasies, right?
I also want to talk about, you touched on the comic books, but those are two things that have come up since I think our last interview. Tell me about Gun
Yes.
Honey and Heatseeker because phenomenal reads.
Thank you so much. So Gun Honey is a comic that I write and is drawn by an artist in Malaysia named Angkor Keng, who's brilliant. His work really looks like a young Frank Frazetta. It's
Hmm.
incredibly detailed. It's done manually in the classic style with actual pens on paper. He sends me photographs of pages in progress, and you see T squares and erasers and things. And it's gorgeous. It's really beautiful. And the idea was we started Hard Case Crime Comics about, as I said, 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. And we did a number of comics that I was extremely proud of. One was, in fact, Krista Faust and Gary Phillips called Peepland, and one
Hmm.
was Megan Abbott and Allison Galen called Normandy Gold. We did a couple with Max Allan Collins, who did Road to Perdition. One was Quarry, and one was Mike Hammer. And I'm proud of these books. And they sold different degrees of success, some more, some less, but I never wrote one myself. And I promised Titan, that publishes these through the Titan Comics imprint, I promised that I would write one myself at one point. But I thought wherever it would land smack in the middle of the pack. It wouldn't be the worst seller, it wouldn't be the best seller. But what ended up happening is I wrote this comic called Gun Honey about a femme fatale whose job it is to get you whatever weapon you need, when you need it, where you need it, no matter how impossible. She could
Hmm.
get a taser into the Vatican. She can get a machine gun into a high security prison, whatever you need. It's like the character in The Godfather who places the gun where Al Pacino can get it so he can shoot the two people in the Italian restaurant. Somebody's got to put the gun there. Who puts it there? Well, Gun Honey, that's the character. And she's beautiful. She's sort of a James Bond type figure, but
Hmm.
a Bond girl also, all wrapped up in
Hmm.
one. And the comic came out, and it became by far our best-selling comic of all time. I think maybe Titan's best-selling comic of all time. It was one of the best-selling independent comics. I think, in fact, issue number 1 was the top-selling independent comic of whatever month that was. And so they said, we need to do Gun Honey 2. So I did that. And then they said, we need to do Gun Honey 3. But Ong, who does the art in Malaysia, the good part is he's incredibly talented, but it takes a very long time. If you're
Hmm.
actually doing cross hatching with a pen on
Yeah.
paper, you can't just turn that out overnight. And so we said, well, let's do a spin-off series, a little like John Wick, where you've got in the world of John Wick, right?
Hmm.
So Heatseeker is an ex-girlfriend of Joanna Tan. Joanna Tan is Gun Honey. So her ex-girlfriend is a woman named Dahlia Racers, and her
Hmm.
criminal shtick is if you're marked for murder, she'll help you disappear. No matter how difficult,
So good.
etc. She won't get you weapons, but she'll help you disappear. And she is I like she's a little bit more of a giddy, reckless character. So Joanna in Gun Honey is a little bit more brooding. She's more Christian Bale, and
Hmm.
Dahlia Racers is a little more Tom Cruise, if you want to think of it
Mm.
that way.
I like
And
that.
so I put out Heatseeker, and that did well. So now I've got these two lines of comics. I have to write Heatseeker 2, which I'm currently about 12 pages into, and Gun Honey 3 is going to come out in May. And so
Hmm.
bit by bit, Gun Honey and Heatseeker are hopefully finding a following. It's Pulp Fiction.
Hmm.
It's not bleak and depressing. It's violent. It's a little
Hmm.
Tarantino like. And I hope that people get the same kind of pleasures out of it that they'd get from watching, a movie. It's like the crime equivalent of Barbarella. Very
Yes.
sexy, full of weird locations and crazy
Mm-hmm.
exotic stuff. And I think in Gun Hunting 3, which comes out starting in May, it'll be a
Mm-hmm.
4-issue comic book series, and then it'll get collected as a graphic novel. In Gun Hunting 3, we start in the jungles of Borneo, where Joanna is hiding from people who want to kill her. We then go to Yokohama, Japan on a tramp steamer, because tramp steamer.
Yes.
Then in Yokohama, we end up in Gunma province at a 900-year-old onsen where bad things happen. From there, we go to where do we go next? We go to Mongolia, where a gangster has his lair, but
Ooh.
the lair turns out to be under the sands of the Gobi Desert. And then, for the big finale, once we discover what's in his hidden vault, we discover a very significant assassination plot that is going to be pulled off if our heroine doesn't do something about it, which is scheduled to take place at the Summer Olympics in Paris.
Ooh.
What more do you want? If you can have Paris, the Gobi Desert, Mongolia, Borneo, that's a story
Mm-hmm.
right there. So anyway, one of the things I like is the final issue, I think, is going to come out right when the Summer Olympics are happening. So you'll be able to go
Ooh.
to this comic book store and see this assassination plot play out at the Summer Olympics in France at right when it's actually going on television. Now that assumes we don't end up with delays or something, but I'm hopeful that we can do that, even though I'm not sure anyone will care really, but I thought it would be a fun thing to do.
Hey, it's always neat to be able to mirror those things in real time when possible. It just
It's great fun. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure my version of the Summer Olympics, by the way, drawn by somebody in Malaysia who has, I don't know if he's ever been to France. I supplied a variety of photographs that might be helpful, but part of it takes place at Versailles. So
ooh.
we're pulling out all the stops. The nice thing about instead of filming an action movie, making an
Mm-hmm.
action comic book,
Mm-hmm.
is you don't have to worry about the budget.
Yes.
You can film at Versailles. Nobody's going to stop you, and you don't have to worry about the stunts being too dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
You can have your
Yeah.
characters, jump out of a helicopter. Nobody's going to get hurt. And I love doing that. I think if I go to Hollywood and I put all this in a script, they're going to kill me. What? We're not going to the Gobi Desert. What are you talking about? And no, she can't jump out of a helicopter. But in my comic, she can
Mm-hmm.
jump out of whatever she wants to jump out of.
Well, and what I love is maximizing the medium that it is. It really is taking advantage of. So this is something that so I read a great book earlier this year called the Nolan Variations.
Okay.
And it's all basically a retrospective on Nolan's films. The thing I did not appreciate as much as I did before as after is he's a really big noir fan, like in terms of films and
Makes
books.
sense if you think back, right? Some of the things he's done.
But the other thing is he's very dedicated to the idea of let's make a movie that can only be a movie. Like this, let's do the thing that can only be what this medium is. And
That's
taking
great. Yeah.
advantage of that, like with the comic book, this is something visually you can do that can't necessarily just be on the page. This is something visually you could do that would be nearly impossible to put on screen. And that's so cool.
That's true. It's interesting, right? When you think, what's the difference? What can you do in a comic that you can't do on film? I've written for television. I've never written for film. But you do, it's very different. And you quickly realize what the difference is. You can't really, technically you can, but in practice, you can't put a voiceover in a film anymore. People will laugh.
Mm-hmm.
But in comic books, you can have written narration inside the head in the voice of the main character, and it works. People like it, and so you can do internal monologue in a comic book in a way you can't in film anymore. But on the other hand, what you can't show in a comic book is motion.
Mm-hmm.
You're always showing snapshots.
Mm-hmm.
You show the box open or you show it closed. You can't show a person opening a box. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to figure out, how do you show an action story in an inert medium?
Mm-hmm.
It's a real challenge. But you can do all you want in terms of settings. You can do all you want in
Mm-hmm.
terms of vehicles and guns and so on. There was an interesting episode that happened just a few months ago. At the end of the summer, I was called for jury duty.
Oh.
And I'm happy to serve on jury duty. I never
Mm-hmm.
get it because I'm a crime writer. And as soon as they say, could you tell the court what you do? The lawyers always kick me out because they say, we don't want we don't want Hercule Poirot there solving our mystery. In this case, they enjoined us not to say anything about the individual defendant. I don't even remember his name, but it was some kind of gun possession case. This
Mm-hmm.
person was accused of possessing a gun. And I had to say, I believe I can be fair and impartial. I believe I can be a good juror and do an honorable job. But counsel has to decide if they want the author of Gun Honey Comics rendering a verdict on their gun case. And within hours, I was on the street again. What are you going to do? I just felt I had to tell them up front. I didn't want, the New York Post to discover it later, and then, their whole case is ruined. So there you go. I think
I feel like that's a very comedic short story that could be written, to be honest, of like the crime writer that keeps like getting called for jury duty but never actually does it.
Yeah. I agree. That would be a fun story. Maybe I'll write it. I will give you credit if I do.
Oh, thank you.
There's apparently some book that has it's a jury duty crime novel that has, I think it's a serial killer story, and the killer is on the jury. And I actually, I haven't read it, but I remember hearing about it. So if anyone, sees this interview and wants to put in the comments what the book was, I was curious about it and then I forgot what it was. But, and then of course there's a TV show called Jury Duty, which has nothing to do with crime, but I've heard it's very funny. So I'll have to check that out.
And then I can't remember, you guys have a Rex Stout book coming out this year too.
So we discovered two very obscure old Rex Stout books. So Rex Stout, for anyone who doesn't know, was the creator of a very famous detective named Nero Wolfe. Everyone loves Nero Wolfe. I've never met anyone who read the Nero Wolfe books and didn't fall in love with them. They're very funny, light, frothy comedies. Nero Wolfe is an obese detective, brilliant genius who never leaves his brownstone. And he's got a second in command named Archie Goodwin, who walks around and is his leg man and does all the work that involves moving. And then Nero Wolfe solves the crimes. And that's what he became famous for, world famous, and movies were made, stage shows and so on.
Sydney Greenstreet, I think, voiced him for the radio drama.
I didn't remember
that happened.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, he kind of has the build for it, although for radio it doesn't matter. But yeah, so Stout started his career in the late 1920s, and he wrote 4 novels that I think he saw as serious literary novels. And he was thinking of himself as he was going to be a realist literary writer. And he was very good. His writing, his prose is outstanding. And they didn't sell well. They sold terribly. And he wrote a poem later, a comic poem about, why did you start writing detective stories? Because of the money. And and he said, I can tell whatever story I want in the context of a detective novel. The difference is a detective novel sells well and a mainstream literary novel doesn't. So as a matter of curiosity, I tracked down copies of these books, which was not easy. One of them, actually 3 of them, have never been reprinted. They were published in 1930, 31, 32, 33, and they never even had a paperback edition. Why? Because paperbacks didn't exist yet. The first paperback in America was 1939. Even in England, even in the UK, when Penguin started, it was 1934. So, Stout writes a book in 1930. There are no paperbacks. Of course, there's no paperback edition. So this book, he wrote a book, his second novel, I believe second, called Seed on the Wind. I read all 4, and 2 of them are wonderful, and 2 of them less so. One of them really just doesn't work at all, and one of them works but has no crime element in it. But Seed on the Wind is a brilliant story about this woman, an independent-minded, very modern, considering that she was from 1930.
I was going to say, yeah, for the time especially.
Very strange, it really committed to reproductive freedom and stuff like that, which in 1930 was pretty rare. So there's this woman who has had 4 children with 4 different men.
Wow.
So that's to start with. She's living in a house with children from 4 different men. She's not married to any of them. One of them's dead, but the others aren't, and she's not married to any of them. She did marry the dead one. And a 5th man shows up in the driveway, and she runs and hides. Why? And so that's the mystery at the beginning. And we go back in time, and we meet the 4 men that she had children with, and we learn about her history and her past. And by the end of the book, we know who the 5th man was, why she ran and hid from him, why she why she had children with these 4 men, what was the psychological underpinning for this. And it takes a very dark turn. It eventually involves murder, and it also involves blackmail and kidnapping in a sort of abortive way. And it's not really a crime novel, but it has crime in it. It's very much a mystery novel. It's kind of like a psychological jigsaw puzzle. And we published that book for the first time in 93 years in December. We didn't save that one for our 20th anniversary, but it was pretty close. December 12th, 18 more days, 20 more days, and we would have been in the 20th anniversary year. In the 20th anniversary year, we're going to publish his very first novel, which was called How Like a God. That one also has a wonderful premise. There's a man in a brownstone in New York City climbing the stairs. He starts at the ground floor and he starts climbing. In his pocket is a revolver. He has in mind he's going to kill the woman who's waiting on the second floor. but we don't know who this woman is. And as he climbs step by step up the brownstone stairs, which is like classic suspense, every chapter he gets another step closer. As he climbs, we go back into his brain, we go back in time, and we meet every woman he's interacted with. And we're thinking, is this the one he's going to kill? Is this the one? And we meet his sister, and we meet the woman that he lost his virginity to, and we meet his first love interest, and so on. And we eventually find out who it is. And it all builds to this shocking act of violence when he gets to the top of the stairs.
It sounds like the dark version of How I Met Your Mother.
It's very much like that. That's right, exactly. And in fact, so is Seat on the Wind in its own peculiar way. It's a good book. It's told in a very experimental style. Remember, this is around the time that Gertrude Stein is writing her experimental fiction. James Joyce is writing his experimental fiction. And he was writing it, and he wrote it, half is written in second person present tense. You begin to climb the stairs. You have a gun in your pocket.
Oh,
that's already disorienting and strange. And we're in the mind of a character you come to realize is not what you would think of as psychologically whole. You would hope that anyone climbing a staircase trying to get someone shot is not psychologically whole, but this guy has his own bag of problems. And the psychology of it is fascinating and very well done. The suspense is terrific. And that one is coming this July. And for the cover there, I don't have a copy yet because we haven't printed our advanced copies, but we have a painting by Ricky Mujica, who's a wonderful present day painter of a staircase at a vertiginous angle. We're looking up at a woman on the second floor. She's holding a gun just because, it's one of our covers. In the book, she's not holding a gun, but that's okay. And the staircase is based on the back stairs at the apartment building where I live in Manhattan. I took some photos for Ricky.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that's fun. And the woman, I mean, it's fun for me. Nobody else will know what those stairs are, but they're my stairs. And the woman is based on a photograph taken by the great mid-century paperback painter, Robert Maguire, who died before we could ever get a painting from him. I did talk to him once, but already he was quite old and didn't feel he could paint anymore. And then relatively soon after that, he died. But his daughter gave me access to his photo files. He would take reference photos of models, or sometimes for the men himself. And so I have a big pile of black and white photos. And I said to her, what if I give these photos to our current artists and let them paint a modern cover based on your dad's photography? And so the woman on the cover of How Like a God is a Robert Maguire model painted by Ricky Mujica. So it's like a posthumous collaboration between a current painter and an old-time deceased painter. And it's a cover that I'm very fond of. I think it's a very strong cover. Not every cover we do is great. Out of 150, I could pick out a handful that I didn't think were that great. But when they work, they really work well. And so I'm excited about that book too. It's so experimental that I think some readers may have a hard time reading it, because who is used to reading second person present tense?
Yeah.
But if you dig into it, if you take the time and make the effort, it's worth it. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. And frankly, still shocking. You read it and you think, did people actually say that stuff in 1929? And I think mostly they didn't. In actual popular in pop culture of the time, you couldn't say things. There was censorship. But in the literary world, in the experimental literary world of Greenwich Village and so on, you got away with a lot. And Rex Stout, nobody thinks of him as a bawdy writer or a risk-taking writer. His books are all very clean. Well, not these. I mean, it's done for the best reasons. As a writer, as an artist, it's not gratuitous, but it's still today quite shocking. When we hear about this killer's sexual history, there's a lot there that maybe current readers will look at and say, oh, really? I think he's deflowered, if I remember correctly, by his Sunday school teacher.
Oh,
when he's still underage. And that's where the book starts.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't get lighter from there. So this is, and look, these things do happen. You read the newspapers, you find headlines about a teacher who takes advantage of a male student. Okay, so how does this character end up the way he ends up? Well, that's a good starting point. And of course, for good measure, it's a Sunday school teacher. Right? It's not just any teacher. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I did have one fan of Rex Stout email me the other day, very angry, saying, I'm sure Stout never wanted this book to be reprinted. That's why it didn't get reprinted for 90 years. I'm disgusted. It's trash. And I said, well, I think it's because it's so different from Nero Wolfe. And he
Mm-hmm.
was going and hoping for a Nero Wolfe book. And I said, well, look, I respect your opinion. I'm glad to say I don't share it. I think it's a wonderful book. I really genuinely love it. This was not, sometimes you'll see a book and it's a rare book by an author who's famous, and you'll say,
Mm-hmm.
will I publish this book? It's really bad.
Mm-hmm.
But do I hold my nose and publish it anyway because fans will buy it? And I just never want to do that. It's like
Mm-hmm.
that. I'm not going to publish the other two Rex Stout books because
Yeah.
one of them isn't good and one of them wouldn't fit. But these two books I'll stand behind with great pride. These books I
Mm-hmm.
will put up against any book written by anyone in the last 90 years and defend, because they are shocking, but they are
Mm-hmm.
really, really good.
Well, and I think that that's the secret sauce to hard case crime is that each one of your guys' books, I am able to definitively know someone looked at this and went, okay, this meets the criteria, and this is a good book. This is worth bringing back if it's an older book, or this is
Oh, thank
someone's
you.
voice that really should be shared.
It's all, I feel the same way, but of course it's my taste. So of course I'll feel that way. It's good to hear that somebody else does. And we don't have to please every reader out there. Not everyone likes hard boiled. Not everyone
Yeah.
likes noir. Not everyone likes crime fiction, and not everyone likes reading. So we're not going to please everyone. But I think
Mhm.
anyone who does like some of these latter day manifestations of noir or crime fiction, anyone who went to see The Usual Suspects in the movie theater. Now they're pretty old at this point if they saw it in the movie theater, but anyone who enjoyed movies like LA Confidential or
Mhm.
Chinatown, or anyone who has fond memories of TV shows, even relatively recent TV shows like True Detective
Mhm.
or Fargo, will find hard case crime simpatico. There's a lot on the page in a hard case crime book that will push the same buttons that you get pushed by that kind of film or TV. You see much more crime on TV these days than you do, or in podcasts, right?
Mhm.
So if people enjoy that kind of story, they'll find that kind of story in hard case crime books. And then hopefully some people will give it a try. I don't expect to start a reading habit in a lifelong non-reader, but our books are short. They have they have cool cover art, if that
Well, and
helps get you there.
honestly, I think that the length that your guys' books tend to works better for at least I know my sensibilities. I like a book that just gets to the point. Let's get going. Let's tell the story. Let's enjoy the story. Something that's too long and too literary starts to drag. Like, why am I wasting my time with this?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's certainly readers who like that too. We've tried a few books that were a little more literary in style, and I think you're right. I think our readers didn't have the patience for some of those. I mean, some readers did and liked them,
Mhm.
but and I'll try them. If I still love a book and it's a little literary, I'll try it once in a while just because I love it. And if
Mhm.
somebody else doesn't, that's okay. They can buy another one, different one.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, the stouts are definitely not so literary that people will be put off by it. Except, How Like a God does have that first person, the second
I
person.
think that that's going to be really interesting to
It'll
read
be
just because,
interesting.
again, it's that difference of, and I don't think that we appreciate today how much we take for granted the way books are written. I
Yeah.
was reading of that, like, Stein generation, the lost generation, that Paris click when I was doing my Hemingway binge.
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
it was just fascinating to see how much the conversation. So, one of my favorite books last year was Maxwell Perkins,
Uh-huh.
Editor of Genius
Yeah.
by Scott A. Berg. Amazing book. For one, it gives me an incredible amount of respect for what editors do in the process. So, thank you for being a
Thank you,
good
Maxwell
editor.
Perkins. Uh,
The Maxwell Perkins of today. Thank you.
well,
Uh,
I don't know. I don't know about that, but I mean, Maxwell Perkins, he did inspire me in many ways. He inspired me not to be afraid to say to a writer, um, I think something needs to be done here. It's
mhm.
okay for the writer to do it himself, not want the editor to start tinkering with his words, although some writers actually appreciate it if you tinker with their words. But um, you can't be something you can't be. You shouldn't be shy. I find a
Mhm.
lot of editors working today, not the best ones, but a lot of editors working today are just acquiring editors. They
Mm.
see a book that they like, it's in good enough shape, or in their opinion is in good enough shape as it is, and they acquire it. And then they go on and acquire the next book. They might do some trace copy editing, but they often don't go in with the red pencil and really mark it up. Now, some of our books don't need any markup. That's fine. But sometimes you get a book that has the seed of greatness in it, real greatness, but it needs work. Uh, Even Five Decembers, sentence by sentence, didn't need work. It's beautifully written. But there was one detour the plot took toward the end, not the very end, just before the very end. There was a detour the author took, and it wasn't working. And now that's a book that worked 98%, but those pages, the 2% that didn't work, needed to be fixed, because it was very clear this could be one of the best books we ever published, but not with those pages. Those pages needed to be fixed. So I went to the author and I said, how would you feel about fixing them? Here's what's wrong with them. Now, what do you want to do? And he came back, rewrote them, and it won the Edgar Award. But you can't be afraid as an editor to do that. You have to have enough confidence in your skill as a reader to say, I can tell what's working and I can tell what's not working. And you don't have to share my opinion. If you don't have to sell me your book. That's fine. But please let me help you make this as good as it can be. And sometimes that literally means changing words in every single sentence. That's rare, but that does happen sometimes. And you see a marked up manuscript page that looks blood spattered. And, I learned that at the hands of an editor named Eleanor Sullivan, who was the editor of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine for many years. From the death of Fred Danet, who was half of the writing team that used the name Ellery Queen and founded the magazine in 1941, when he died, Eleanor took over and she edited it until 1991 when she died. And I sold my first short story to her, and it needed a lot of editing. I didn't know that. I was 18 years old. What did I know? I did the best I could. And she handed me back the story and said, I'll take it, but look what I've done to it. And every sentence had, I think she used a blue pencil, but it's, had red ink on it. Every sentence had ink. And it was brutal, but it was a wonderful education for me. And it taught me not just how to be a better writer, but what an editor does. If an editor does their job right. And she saw potential. It was only potential. It was very raw. And she took the time and said, this is how what you turned in that was not ready can be made better. It's still not my best story. It's not in the book, but oh my God, it was better than when I handed it to her. And I want to do that for other writers. And so when I edit, a page often does get marked up a lot, but it's done with love. It's not done out of hostility or ego or anything like that. It's I love this book and I want other people to love it too. And this is some of the work I think might need to be done. And then, some writers say stet is inside baseball term for revert to the way it was before you mucked around with it. And that's fine. In the end, every choice should be the author's. But I want to give them that choice. And fortunately, many of our authors are patient with my with my amount of ink and don't mind it, or tell me they don't mind.
Well, it's been well worth it. We have 20 years of incredible books, and I'm looking forward to 20 more years.
Well, thank you. I don't know if there'll be 20 more years. I'm not a spring chicken anymore, but there will certainly at least be one more year, and we just take it, as they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, one day at a time. But yeah, 20th anniversary of Hard Case Crime is going to run all year long. We're going to start in February with Nobody's Angel. March, Death Comes Too Late. May, Into the Night. July, I don't have it in front of me, will be How Like a God by Rex Stout. And then hopefully there'll be some other surprises by the end of the year, like the movie tie-in edition of The Actor, if the movie comes out on time. A new Quarry novel by Max Allan Collins called Quarry.
So excited.
Can't Keep a Good Man Down. And I'm glad. And then 2025, we'll see. We're beginning to get our first inklings of what writers might turn in for 2025, and I'm excited. So we'll see. Thank you for having me on the show again. I am always delighted to talk about this. One of my favorite topics, as you might imagine, and thank you for being interested and patient. And I look forward to more books and more readers.
Hey, absolutely. And people can go find your books at hardcasecrime.com, Amazon, and all the places.
Yep, Amazon, any other online bookseller, pretty much any traditional bookseller. They don't all carry them, but they all can. You can order them through Random House, just like any Random House book. And so if your local bookseller doesn't carry them and you would like them to, just go up to the front desk and say, have you ever heard of Hard Case Crime? Please carry them. And yeah, but you can always order them online. That's a totally fine thing to do. And you can find sample chapters from every one of the 149 or whatever it is at hardcasecrime.com. Up there for free. Enjoy. The hope is if you read the first chapter, you'll want to come back for more. And if anyone has suggestions, questions, they can always reach me by email. So any email address that ends at hardcasecrime.com is me. So feel free to get in touch.
And we'll link all of that in the show notes. Charles, thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you. Have a good day.